Trump is now officially confirming the biggest trigger for the Bitcoin price escalation. He's writing this now in a new tweet. Interest rates are finally supposed to be lowered now. That's going to pump Bitcoin and the stock markets up. Just a few minutes after he posted that, we see the new inflation data, which initially looks like inflation is higher than expected. And that means a lot of uncertainty is coming into the market, because high inflation also means we can't necessarily lower interest rates, since we have inflation issues. Then we should actually be raising interest rates instead. But Donald Trump wants to do the opposite here. Jerome Powell is always pushing back, saying we have to keep interest rates steady or be very, very cautious. With the whole thing, Donald Trump is taking the exact opposite approach, saying, hey folks, screw it, we need to pump the economy, we need to pump Bitcoin, we need to pump the stock markets. Of course, he doesn't say it exactly like that, but that seems to be what he's really up to here now. He wants to increase the risk values here, but the market is currently showing something different. The inflation data doesn't look like it's pointing to interest rate cuts, but rather the exact opposite. We're going to take a close look at this. Additionally, there's a massive statement from BlackRock that is saying something unbelievable, but it's actually not a new statement, it's an older one. We're still going to take a look at this. First, let's take a look at the inflation data. We now have the highest inflation data since June 2024, so we're really seeing that inflation is picking up speed again. We're also seeing the S&P 500 selling off. Bitcoin also sold off a bit, but then it made a rebound. He has now pushed back a bit against that. But that still brings more uncertainty into the market. The consumer price index inflation in January rises to 3%, which is above the expectations of 2.9%. The core inflation of the consumer price index rises to 3.3%, which is above the expectations of 3.1%. So we're clearly above expectations here. The overall inflation of the consumer price index has been rising for 4 consecutive months. And the core CPI is officially on the rise again. Inflation in the US is hot, and that's a crazy sign because I'll say it again. High inflation doesn't necessarily mean falling interest rates. Falling interest rates would be good for Bitcoin. That would mean new liquidity, fresh money for Bitcoin. That could also boost Bitcoin and the stock markets. Donald Trump wants to do that. Donald Trump wants to lower interest rates, but the data just doesn't support that right now. What's really, really interesting is that Jerome Powell also said a few months ago, yeah, inflation, it's somewhat under control. Now you can see inflation is really coming back strong. And all of this is happening even though they haven't even lowered interest rates. So the big interest rate cuts happened last year when they made that 50 basis point cut here from the Federal Reserve. We didn't see any interest rate cuts in January. Still, inflation is coming back here. And that should definitely give you something to think about. And the markets definitely don't see that in a good light. One reason is that the markets always love it when there are low interest rates, when there's a lot of liquidity, and when there's not so much liquidity and not such low interest rates. Then the markets won't be doing so well at first. There was also a very interesting statement about this from Scott Bassett, the Treasury Secretary here in the US, who also made a really, really good statement about this.
I am very concerned about what is happening right now. We have never had a budget deficit like this. We are at 7% of GDP in terms of the deficit. We've never had this when it's not a recession, not a war. And what do we have to show for it? They have created 18,000 manufacturing jobs. Last year, the economy only created 250,000 private sector jobs. This is a takeover of the government of the private sector.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bassett here in the United States says this very clearly. He is scared because things look very, very problematic here. We have record deficits here, and we haven't seen these record deficits even during wartime. If we're in a recession or a major economic crisis here, no, it's just standard business. And now we have such huge deficits here. Now there's the Department of Government Efficiency, which wants to get things back on track. That means the US is just spending more money than it takes in. I mean, it's a pretty simple calculation. It's like every year you somehow spend 20,000 euros, but only have 500 euros in income. It's looking similar in the U.S. Maybe not quite that bad, but definitely heading in that direction. The Department of Government Efficiency now appears to be saving $1 billion a day. But they would need to save $5 to $6 billion a day to bring the deficit back into balance. And there's still a whole lot missing. I also have the exact tweet from Donald Trump. He writes here that interest rates should be lowered, which fits well with the upcoming tariffs. Let's rock and roll, America, let's fucking go. And now there are different sides you can work on here. That means Donald Trump wants to lower interest rates. But here you have the short end on one side and the long end on the other. So the short end, that's what Donald Trump always talks about. Hey, Jerome Powell, lower the interest rates, lower the interest rates. He also said he wants to meet with Jerome Powell to talk about it. But Jerome Powell says no, he's not backing down. Instead, he's keeping an eye on inflation. That means the Federal Reserve is watching inflation. Donald Trump is watching the economy. Donald Trump is watching the stock markets. Donald Trump is watching crypto, Bitcoin, things like that. So we have basically opposing things that are trying to come together somehow. Donald Trump is basically trying to boost his ego so that he can appear as a strong president and then say, hey, I have strengthened the economy here. The Fed has a different agenda here. The Fed really just wants to focus on price stability, meaning they're looking at inflation numbers. And it doesn't really look that way right now if you lower the interest rates. And those are basically the two opposing forces at play. But now there's the Department of Government Efficiency. And if they cut government spending here, if they give people more confidence in the dollar again, then the demand for the dollar will also rise. Then maybe more people will buy US Treasury bonds. This will automatically lead to lower interest rates at the long end. That means Donald Trump is basically working on both the short and long ends to bring interest rates down. The long end is more influenced by the Department of Government Efficiency, especially if they can convincingly show that, hey, the US is on the right track, we're solvent again, we're improving, and we're cutting government spending. Then confidence in the US dollar will rise, and more people will buy Treasury bonds at the long end. The interest rates on 10-year Treasury bonds are going down, and on top of that, it's just when it comes to short-term interest rates, Donald Trump can't do much except put pressure on Jerome. And we really need to pay close attention to how this unfolds, because both of these have a massive impact on the Bitcoin price, since Bitcoin is simply 83% correlated with the global M2 money supply. The biggest influence on the global M2 money supply is simply the US dollar. There was also a super exciting assessment by Luke Croman who talks about massive catalysts that are also happening now. Bitcoin can really be pulled out of this urgent situation. You absolutely have to check this out.
The big structural impact ultimately is, tactically, inflation, dollar up, disruption, whatever. Okay, interesting. But to me, that's not the real, that's the warm up. To me, the main event is 100% tariffs to force people from exiting the dollar system will nearly instantaneously drive the ending of the post-$71 system, because the world is not going to sit and, we're going to starve because of these tariffs. No, they're going to go, hey, Russia, I see you're settling in Bitcoin. Great. Or gold, whatever they got to do. They're going to move to gold and Bitcoin, some mixed way, shape, or form. And the reality is gold and Bitcoin aren't priced in the correct zip code.
Yeah.
If this is even directionally accurate.
Yeah.
Bitcoin would need at least one, a different digit in front of it. At least, and probably, and gold probably needs one too.
He says here that everything happening right now, that indeed inflation is getting out of control, that we're seeing turbulence now, this is the ultimate structural influence on Bitcoin. And that's the big event you need to pay attention to. And that's also what will make Bitcoin moon here. He says that Bitcoin at least deserves another digit in front, as the first number. What he means is that Bitcoin should have a 2 in front instead of a 1, so instead of 100,000, it should be 200,000. Sure, we're a bit under 100,000 right now. But he's now talking about the crazy event that's coming our way. And this has to do with interest rates, it has to do with tariffs, it has to do with Donald Trump, and it has to do with the Department of Government Efficiency. And this is really, really important to understand. He says that the tariffs that Donald Trump is now implementing, and if Donald Trump raises the tariffs even further, he mentions in the worst case up to 100% tariffs. Donald Trump has already announced that anyone who moves away from the US dollar will face 100% tariffs. And if Donald Trump goes through with that, it won't strengthen the dollar. Instead, it will lead to the downfall of the dollar. Because the other nations, according to Luke Roman, Russia, China, they're not going to let themselves be suppressed by the US dollar anymore. Instead, they're already working on alternatives, whether it's Bitcoin or their own payment instruments. And that's going to lead to people fleeing into Bitcoin. So he's also talking about capital controls here. Well, he doesn't get into it too specifically, but that's what he's trying to say, that the US is shutting itself off, that the US is trying to suck other countries into its system, and anyone who's part of the system will be trapped in it. This means that if you take capital out of the country, you will be punished. If you don't play along with the system, you'll be punished, because that's the only way to maintain such a socialist, big system in the long run. At first, you can keep it going by making the system really, really attractive. At some point, the system will spiral out of control. Then you have to suck people into the system, keep them inside the system, and force them into the system. And you have to prevent people from breaking out of the system. And then exactly these kinds of stories come to light, like what Luke Drummond said, that at some point, people will get fed up and start looking for alternative systems. And that's when the big time for Bitcoin will come. Also for gold, when people will be fleeing into Bitcoin and fleeing into gold. I've mentioned this in other videos too, that the next big trigger could really be not greed, where people want to make even more gains. Where they smell that, okay, Bitcoin is mooning again, and now we can jump in and make a ton of money. Now, Maybe the next big trigger will be that people are afraid in. Being trapped in the system, that people are afraid of going down with the system, that they're scared of, hey, drowning on the Titanic. And then there are the lifeboats, and the best lifeboat is Bitcoin. Maybe the second best lifeboat is gold. I don't know, maybe there are other lifeboats, but Bitcoin is definitely right up there. And those are the relevant statements from Luke Croman that you should really take to heart. And then there was something else. What has really taken off on social media is that BlackRock made an unbelievable statement, saying that Bitcoin is no longer a risk-on asset, but rather a risk-off asset. So exactly what Luke Croman described, that when there's a crisis, everyone will flee into Bitcoin. And the presentation will also be shared here. But I already made a video about that 4 months ago. This isn't a new statement. BlackRock made this statement 4 months ago, but now it's being hyped up again on social media. Yeah, that's a massive statement. The statement changes everything. But to be fair, it is still not a new statement. It's crazy that BlackRock recognizes the value of Bitcoin like this. That really underscores what Luke Croman is saying. But still, it's not a new statement. It's an old statement that still holds just as much relevance. And if you want to buy Bitcoin, check out 21 Bitcoin. Here you can easily and safely buy Bitcoin with the code BitcoinHotel. You can still get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin here. See you later. Peace out.